Good morning and welcome to the 28th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2019. Can I ask everyone in the public gallery to please switch off or turn to silent your devices? We've received apologies this morning from Anas Sarwar and Alex Neil. I welcome John Mason, who is attending in place of Alex Neil today. Item 1 is Declaration of Interests. Can I please invite John Mason to declare any relevant interest to the committee?
Thank you, Convener. I'm very happy to be here. I think the only thing I would declare is that I'm a member of ICAS, Chartered Accountant.
Thank you very much indeed. Item 2 is decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 5 and 6 in private this morning? Thank you. Item 3 is our post-legislative scrutiny of the Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting today, Darren Fitzhenry, Scottish Information Commissioner, and Lorraine Curry, Freedom of Information Officer, Policy and Information from the Office of the Scottish Information Commissioner. Darren Fitzhenry, I understand you have a brief opening statement.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to the committee for this opportunity to provide evidence on the post-legislative scrutiny of the Freedom of Information Scotland Act, or FOISA, as we tend to call it. I'm grateful to the committee for looking at FOISA, not because it's broken, but because it could be better. And it's important to keep it alive, up to date, to meet the challenges ahead. In doing that and in looking at the Act, I think it's important to put it into context, to highlight the current aspects of the system that are working and that are good, allowing us to focus on those areas where improvements can be made. Our starting point is that freedom of information is generally working well. There are high levels of public awareness, up to 91%. And when we delve deeper, looking at knowledge and what the right means to people in real life, we've got 71% of people understanding that freedom of information gives them a right to ask for information from public bodies. And that compares with 54% awareness of that right throughout the UK as a whole. Last year, we saw over 83,000 requests for information being made across Scotland, of which 75% resulted in full or partial disclosure of the information, and about 3/4 of that was full disclosure of the information. Over the last 3 years, the rate of responses on time has consistently been around 85%. Across authorities. Now, that's obviously something we want to improve upon, but it's still relatively high despite increasing volumes. So most of the time when people exercise their right, they get the information they were looking for first time and on time. Request activity, however, is only the tip of the iceberg, as freedom of information users can and do access information which has been proactively published in accordance with FOISA's proactive publication duty. Preliminary findings from Dundee University's Uncovering the Environment project indicate what we would expect to find, namely that when people are looking for information, they'll tend to go online and search for it themselves first. I've got more to say on proactive publication, hopefully later in the evidence session, but for present purposes, the point is that we've got a system the public are aware of, it's regularly and increasingly used, it provides people with information to help them meaningfully participate in our processes, and it supports the accountability of public bodies and can also help authorities to improve their services and work with the communities they serve. But as I said at the start, there is room for improvement. I've previously set out in my written and oral evidence to the committee the ways that I think freedom of information could be strengthened, and obviously you've had a lot of other respondents both in paper and oral evidence providing input on that. I'm delighted to see so many inputs. Some of those inputs are of concern, not just for me or nationally, but also in the international context, because if we're looking at how the system is viewed internationally, some of the proposed changes would have the effect of reducing the right to information. And I've been very lucky that it's been suggested that Scotland may for the first time be given a right to information assessment as the first subnational to be put in that position, and hopefully entering into discussions on that. So the top 3 opportunities you'll have read in my evidence, I think, are to modernise the publication scheme duty, to strengthen the intervention powers, and to provide enforcement powers for breaches of the code. And I look forward to dealing with these and any other matters, of course, that the committee would like me to during the course of this morning.
Thank you very much, Information Commissioner. That was extremely helpful. I'd like to open questioning this morning, starting right at the start of the process when people first are seeking information. This committee has heard evidence from quite a few different sources that they feel that hurdles are being put in their place during the request process, which make it harder for people to ask for information. Do you have concerns that the process to make a request is more complicated than it needs to be?
The actual process for making a request is actually relatively straightforward, because all it requires to be is something that's in writing or in permanent form, or capable of being put in permanent form. It needs to set out the individual's name, an address for correspondence, and that could be an email address or a postal address, and state what information the individual is looking for. So it's actually designed to be straightforward. You don't have to mention that it's under FOISA, so you don't need to have knowledge of the Act to make it work. You can send it to anybody in the public authority, so they don't need to know where to send it. They don't need to know that there's a special website that you go to put the request in. So actually, the way it's been designed is to enable people who are unaware of their rights to still be able to exercise them and to get a response to their request for information. So actually, I think that's relatively straightforward. Where problems can come in is perhaps in knowing which authority might hold the information that they're interested in, and also issues of thinking about, well, what is it that I really want to know? Because sometimes crafting an accurate request to get exactly the information that you're after can sometimes be a little bit difficult and takes a bit of thought. But the actual process, I think, is designed to be available to anybody, whether or not they've got access to the internet, whether or not they know who within the authority should have the information.
I think some of the evidence we heard pointed to the fact that perhaps the web page, you say you can just go on and ask, and I'm sure you can, but I think people, if they are thinking freedom of information, you said there was high awareness of the right to get information amongst the population, would then look for a specific page to go to. And I think from what we heard, that varies across certainly the councils, the local authorities in Scotland. Do you think it needs to be more standardised?
I think certainly it would be helpful to have that, but it's important not to lose the general approach of the ability of somebody who doesn't know the system or who doesn't have access to the internet to still be able to get it through other routes. So I certainly think that having single points of contact in authorities is a good idea. It certainly helps the authority if they're available. But I don't think that a system that has that as the only way into freedom of information would be an appropriate way to go, because then you're more likely to exclude the people who perhaps are the least able to know of the processes, who maybe have the least access to the internet, and I wouldn't want to see them disenfranchised from this right.
Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Vera. Just an open question for you. Public service structure and delivery of services have changed quite a bit since FOISA came into force. Is it still fit for purpose against that background?
The Act and the basic right to information, I would submit, is certainly fit for purpose, because you've got the right to request information and the right to receive it. In terms of service delivery, whether it's hitting all of the bodies that it should hit, or whether there should be an expansion of the bodies that are subject to FOISA, I think that's a different question. And I think there we have seen over time a reduction in the access to information because of the way in which public services are provided, as you've set out there, because as more and more public services are contracted out or subject to other types of at arm's length vehicles, it becomes more and more difficult to access that information because those bodies may not be subject to the Act.
So, if I interpret correctly, what you're saying is that basically the Act as it stands is fit for purpose, but the changes have resulted in perhaps other performers coming forward that are not being caught up in the Act.
That's exactly the point, and that's why it's so useful to have powers like the Section 5 power for the ministers to expand the Act to other bodies, as long as those powers are used. And there's been a long period when there was no use of that power, but now, thankfully, since 2013, we've seen that used in 2013 with the cultural, sports and leisure trusts, in 2016 with the privately run prisons, for example, and this year with the registered social landlords, and the new consultation which we're very interested in relation to contracted out services. Well,
you've led right into my next questions, of course, which was in the very subject of these other bodies that have appeared. And one example, for example, which is quite a large one, is health and care partnerships versus NHS boards. And there's a certain amount of tension between these bodies as to who's subject to FOISA and who's not. Do you think, for example, that bodies specifically like health and care partnerships should be subject to the Act?
Yes, we've actually, in our consultation response, which was just put on our website yesterday, we've set out that that's one of the areas where we certainly think the ministers should look at in detail, with a view to that being added to the list in FOISA for clear reasons relating to what happens if things go wrong, the clear public interest, use of public funds. There are many reasons why bodies like that would be appropriate for certainly looking at in detail.
Taking that to its conclusion, do you think that private companies that contract for delivery of public services should be included in the Act?
In relation to that, there's a little bit of a tension between, on the one hand, having a system which includes as many bodies as possible, particularly those that receive substantial public funding, and on the other hand, having a system that is capable of being enforced in practice. So my view is that however these matters are extended, it's important for people to know who is actually covered. So it's important to have a mechanism whereby we can say, well, yes, we know that company is covered by freedom of information, so that requesters know and then they can ask, so that we know and can enforce, and so that the bodies themselves know and can carry out their obligations under the Act.
But what you're saying there is there would have to be some sort of criteria to test against to determine whether that particular body fell under freedom of information.
Yes. How
would you establish that?
My predecessors have set out a series of tests, functional tests, in a special report on whether the right bodies were covered, and I certainly would generally agree with that approach. One of the issues to look at is to have rights been lost. So in other words, is the body carrying out the public functions which were carried out by a public body beforehand and they've now been moved to that private body? Issues of the extent of public finance are obviously relevant. Issues of the public interest in the body or in the functions are also interested. And we're bound by Section 5. I think at the end of the day, it's got to be a public function. And it's, I think things that are purely ancillary, it's much more difficult to say that just because they're getting public money for supplying paper clips is the great example, does that mean that they should be subject to FOISA?
I mean, you're talking about public function. Should it not be determined by the public pound as well? So that if, for example, I mean, even a charity, third sector and so on, they're very heavily subsidised by the Scottish Government to deliver services that, that are agreed between the Scottish Government and those bodies. Given that, following the public pound, is there an interest there in having the Act applicable?
That's an interesting one. I think in a number of jurisdictions, they've got the public functions on the one hand and significant public finance on the other. As I say, I think there's a distinction that if you're spending public money, most of the times it's going to be because there's a public function within that, but not always. So, for example, in relation to your stationery supplies, you just need access to that money. In relation to your windows, you just need them cleaned. Now, while the procurement information of that, we would expect for that to be put out, I don't think that necessarily there's a strong case for the people who happen to do the window cleaning, for example, to be subject to the Act. So following the public pound to its complete end, I don't think is useful. I think looking at where large sums of public money are being expended is something that is relevant in determining whether a body should be caught or not.
Now, the bodies that we'd be talking about here, be it private companies, third sector, whatever, would change from time to time, both in its functions, the amount of funding it receives, and so on. What kind of mechanism would you have in place to be able to respond to that? So you could find that, you know, given the way funding works sometimes at these bodies, you could find one drops off the criteria one year and comes back in another year. How that's a tremendous amount of flexibility to put in place. How would you do that?
And that's why, if you were to see our consultation response, what we have suggested looking at is more focusing on the function test, because we've recognised that where the large amounts of money are coming in, it tends to be in relation to public functions. And by doing that, the ones that we've suggested are as sort of the ones that we think should be looked at first: the health and care services, the PPI and PPP, PFI and PPP contracts, the hubcos and services provided under the hubco model, and transport services. So in relation to those, you'll notice in relation to the big contracts, they're less likely to change too regularly. They tend to be for longer periods. They tend to be more stable in terms of their output.
But if I could interrupt there, that little group that you've just focused on there actually is quite likely to come back and say that there are commercial issues and they're unable to give the information that's required.
And freedom of information FOISA is designed to allow for the commercial aspects to be taken into account in determining whether or not information is actually produced in response to a request. You know, there are exemptions which can be applied in those
I'm just
circumstances.
saying it might be disproportionately high among that grouping.
I wouldn't necessarily say so. I mean, the local authority, public authorities are expending large sums of money. They've got the contracts as well. There will be circumstances when the exemptions apply, and there will be circumstances when they don't apply.
Just one last thing. In your written evidence, you proposed a prohibition on relying on confidentiality clauses between public authorities and contractors providing these public services. Can you give a bit more detail on that proposal and how a similar provision in FOI legislation in Ireland has worked in practice?
In relation to that, I think the point there is very often we can see that confidentiality clauses are inserted into contracts and they're thereafter used in saying, well, we can't provide that information because we're subject to this duty of confidentiality, quite apart from any commercial harm or having to look at the seriousness of the commercial harm. So we're looking at the confidentiality exemption rather than the serious harm exemption. So in practice, it's one which, while we look at the issues of confidentiality, and public interest in determining whether confidentiality exists and whether the right exists, it can be a block to providing information. It makes it easier to, if it's included in the contract, it makes it easier to exclude the provision of information. What we're hoping to do is, by removing that, we're essentially saying, well, if there is a commercial reason why you can't provide the information, rely on the commercial exemption. Now, in relation to Ireland, I don't have detail as to how it has worked in practice. I'll just see if I've got anything more here for you. Well, I can certainly get that for the committee.
Yeah.
In writing, Mr. Fitzhenry.
Can I just ask one more part on that? It seems that if freedom of information is going to have the power to override commercial contracts, which is effectively what it would be because those confidentiality clauses would be in the commercial contract, how would that work in practice legally? Can we do that? Do we have the powers to do that? Yes,
in my view, you certainly could do that. The Act of Parliament could say that this should not be a clause in future contracts, and it can set aside what the limitations are. I mean, we've already got unfair contract terms, for example, in legislation. So in my view, it would be open to the Parliament to decide to do that.
Okay.
Mr Fitzhenry, how about private companies that are actually owned by the government? Should they be subject to FOI?
Yes, if they're wholly owned by the government, then they're already caught by the Act by virtue of Section 6 of the Act. There is, or by any other, if they're wholly owned by any other public authority, there is a bit of a loophole in the legislation at the moment, whereby if they're jointly owned by the Scottish Government and another public authority, they're not caught. So that's one of the sort of technical amendments that in my written evidence we've suggested could be remedied.
Okay, that's interesting. So Ferguson Marine, now wholly owned by the Scottish Government, would come under the gambit of FOI.
Yes.
But V&A Dundee, which is over 50% publicly funded, privately constituted, but that funding comes from a variety of different public sources, wouldn't be caught by FOI.
I haven't looked at the particular one, but from what you've said there, I wouldn't expect it to be no.
No, that's
certainly
my
not under Section
understanding as
6.
well. So you think some of the legislation around this needs a bit of tidying up?
Yes, certainly, particularly where you're looking at bodies that are wholly public owned, but it's a mix of government and authority. We see no reason why they shouldn't be caught by Section 6.
Yes, because that would follow the principle of following the public pound.
Well, it would also follow the principle of that these are wholly public owned. They're controlled in essence,
Yes.
as well.
Okay, Bill Bowman.
Good morning. Can I mention something I don't think you mentioned in your introduction, which is education?
Yes.
And we heard from a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, I think based on an Ipsos Mori poll, that only 25% of young people were aware that they can use FOISA, and that only 28% were confident that they would receive a response if they made a request. Now, you said you thought the system wasn't broken, could be better, generally working well, with 71% awareness overall, but here we have 25% versus that. So what is being done to raise awareness of FOISA amongst young people, including this lack of confidence that they seem to have in the system?
That was certainly a concerning statistic for us, and in our polling data, which we carried out earlier on this year, we noticed that actually, I think it's from 16 to 34 age group, the level of awareness generally, I think, is round about 53 or in that ballpark. I can get the specific figures for the committee, but it's substantially lower than the average of the 71% there, and in the older age groups that increases further beyond 71%. So that there is definitely a difference based on age groups. In order to start looking at that, what we've done is we've engaged with the Scottish Youth Parliament, and in fact Lorraine has been actively involved in that, attending meetings, speaking to them to see what they think should be done to help increase awareness. In addition to that, we've put out infographics, so we're trying to show the rights in a more accessible format, rather than having pages of explanations about how to make an application, how to put it in an appeal, how to seek a review. We've actually got infographics, so you can put it on and it plays with a little jingle in the background, setting out how you do these things. We've also increased our Twitter visibility to try to try to engage with groups and individuals who maybe we haven't caught before on that. I think the key point you mentioned there was education, and I think there's certainly a role for improving the education relating to many issues, around how Scotland works in practice, but including freedom of information. In relation to that, I'm engaged with the Open Government Partnership work, and we have inputted in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment 4, which is looking at, in relation to Commitment scrutiny bodies generally and access to scrutiny bodies. We're inputting in that, and one of the points that I've made is the importance of trying to get education as part of that. And I've also recently met with the Cabinet Secretary for Local Government, I think it's the title, to and mentioned the importance of education in the role there. So we are trying to get a more structured entry into the education system, because that's where people will really become aware of how it can be used in practice. But we're also looking at other practical ways of engaging across the board.
I mean, it seems slightly counterintuitive that younger people are less aware than older people. But from what you were describing, certainly initially, it sounds a little bit passive, you know, increasing your website or you know, putting a jingle in. But were you saying laterally there are actually moves to get out and do something, say, in schools or places of higher education?
Well, what perhaps it could be helpful if Lorraine can tell you some of the conversations she had with the Parliament.
Yeah, we held a workshop at the national sitting of the Scottish Youth Parliament to inform MSYPs of their rights and how to use them effectively, recognising the ways that that could be useful to the MSYPs but also to their constituents. And we've actually produced a report from the back of that based on the feedback that we got from the MSYPs and some of the ideas which came up around that. Some of it was, for example, to produce some new resources. So we're now having a look at which of those we can take forward, which would have the most impact in order to target that particular group, because of the data that you've mentioned, where we can see that there is definitely a difference between the younger population and the older population. We're also looking at, it has been difficult in the past to be able to take resources or to get into the sort of curriculum in terms of educating within schools about FOI, but we are looking at options that we might be able to pursue to take something into schools. It's something we would very much like to do.
What would stop you?
We're not entirely sure the way into that, but we have been having conversations with the Information Commissioner's Office, which is responsible for FOI in the rest of the UK, about different ways that we might be able to take that forward. So it's something we're actively looking at, because we recognise that we do need to do something more for that particular group.
I mean, do you know if Scotland has a different awareness percentage than the rest of the UK in that group?
Not particularly in that group. We do have some data for the general population, which shows that Scotland's actually got higher awareness than the rest of the UK, but we don't have data about that particular group.
So, I mean, it sounds like you're a step or two away from actually doing something, apart from having plans about doing something.
We have plans.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, the problem is education's not within our remit, and if we do want to do something, we actually don't want to just go to school X or school Y and say, oh, well, we've been to two schools and done that. What we want to do is to see about how it can be structurally added to the system, which is why we're trying to piggyback, if you like, on initiatives like the Open Government Partnership to get a way in, so that we're speaking as part of a bigger collective voice and we've got more chance of it happening. So yes, it's not being done, but it's certainly something that we're trying to achieve.
I think that sounds wholly sensible, Information Commissioner.
Just one final point then. I mean, do you actually have a budget to do this? If you wanted to do something, advertise something, I mean, where would the money be?
We've got our current budget, in which we have publicity as one of the areas that we have a budget for. Certainly, that's another benefit of trying to get in through the other organisations, is that we can have impact as part of a bigger picture for less output as well. So it's trying to make efficient use of our resources.
But you don't
as
have
well.
money to run a TV campaign or something.
No. We would have to seek more from the Parliament.
Okay, thank you.
That would be extremely popular, wouldn't it? Okay, Liam Kerr, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd like to move to responding to requests. The committee has looked at the 20 working days response time, and specifically the tension between what is provided in legislation and how that's interpreted. Now, we've heard that 20 days can put the pressure on, but then there's a counter view that whatever limit you would put on, that would become the target, the norm, if you like. So, looking at the appeals you get, How many, are you able to say how many of those are because the 20-day deadline hasn't been met? And of those, what are the key causes of that delay?
Yes. So I'll try and get the statistics for you in relation to that. So failure to respond in the year 1819, the reason of appeals was 27%. Right. So it was a high number of the appeals were on that delay piece.
And what were the causes of that then?
The causes are varied. Sometimes it's human error. Sometimes the reasons given are that it's for the amount of information that we're looking for, it took longer. Sometimes it's issues of clearance. So in other words, the decision making is higher up in the authority. Sometimes it's due to workload pressures. So or the lack of availability of a key individual. So for example, somebody's gone off ill, or somebody's on holiday when it's come in. So there are a number of reasons that might be given for that. But the net effect of it is that it ends up creating more work for the authority at the end of the day, as well as not providing the individual with the information they're entitled to.
And do you think the authorities ever use the seeking clarification clock stopper as a delaying tactic? And if so, how do we prevent that?
It's not used often. As far as I'm aware, I think I would certainly want to have a close look at any case where I did think there was a suggestion that it had been deliberately used as a reason to delay provision of information. But I think that the current construct, whereby in essence you go straight back to point 0 on the clock, is not helpful. I do think that some of the suggestions that have been given to the committee during the evidence of the clock being paused while clarification is being sought would be perhaps a more useful way of moving forward, and a way of helping prevent any attractiveness of it being used to delay providing a response.
Is there another solution? I mean, do you think 20 days is long enough? And if not, do we increase it, or do we just extend the number of circumstances where you could pause?
I think 20 days is long enough. We've got increasing volumes, but as I mentioned in my opening remarks, despite that increasing number of requests, the on-time performance in the region of 85% has remained remarkably similar, certainly over the past 3 years. So we're seeing, and as I said, while 85%, we would like it to be better than that. It's not suggesting that the system is keeling over because of an inability to meet the time. So I think it is manageable. We've got other provisions that it has to be read in context. So we've got other provisions such as the excessive costs provision. So if it's going to cost currently more than £600 to provide that information, then it doesn't have to be provided. So that works. You have to look at the whole suite of provisions in deciding whether 20 days works. Obviously, in the environmental information regulations, you can extend it by another 20 working days if it's voluminous and complex. But you've got less of the voluminous part because you've got the £600 maximum level within FOISA.
I'm going to look at the whole of the picture in 2 seconds, if you don't mind. I'll come back to that, Cap. Just before I do, you mentioned in there, Darren, the increase in the number of requests. Now, I think your annual report talked about an 8% increase in requests last year. And one of the things that the committee's heard is that this puts a lot of pressure on an authority and perhaps makes it challenging for them to comply with the various provisions. So given an 8% increase in requests, is that sustainable? I mean, let's say that continues. Is it, and given the resource pressures that arise, do you take a view on, is there anything other than budget increases that the convener was talking about, which would help an authority comply, so such as more standardisation or sharing a best practice or anything like that?
Yeah, so in terms of helping authorities to comply, I think part of the problem is sometimes the structure of how they deal with freedom of information. Sometimes their own procedures can add to delays. And as I say, once you've got a delay and something's not been provided within the timeline, you've then got an increased chance of an internal review, which sucks up more resource, and an appeal to my office, which again sucks up even more resource. So in many ways, it's the stitch in time concept that if they've got a smooth running ship and good procedures, they should be helping mitigate against additional unnecessary work occurring. There certainly is a resource implication in responding to freedom of information requests. There's no doubt about that. But I think that actually not viewing it as an extra, not viewing it as something else that has to be done, another encumbrance, another bit of governance, but actually viewing it as something that we should be providing to people, that we should be pushing the information out there, can actually help within an authority with that balance of resources being utilised, but also seeing the benefits that they can get out of it. So seeing where, if people are raising issues of waste within an authority, well, that's actually a good thing, because it lets the authority respond and push out that waste. So it needn't be a net sucker up of resource, if you like. There are benefits for the authorities as well. With regard to increasing numbers, yes, if they keep going up and up and up, that's always going to be a concern if they don't eventually plateau. In some ways, it's a good thing, because it shows that the system's being well used. It shows people are actively interested. But one of the mechanisms which we're hoping will actually help it to ease off a bit is proactive publication. Because if I go back to that concept of wanting to push out information, thinking this is something that the authority should do as one of its primary roles, that increases the chance that they're going to be pushing out information voluntarily. So that proactive publication. And as I said earlier, people are more likely to look online for the information first. It's only if it's not online that they're then more likely to go to the authority to seek it. Or if they are going to ask a question, it's more likely to be more specific and then hopefully more easily answered in terms of resource. So yeah, we don't want it to keep going on and on, higher and higher forever. There is a point, but at the moment I think it's manageable within what the authorities are I say they haven't all of a sudden reached a point at which they're imploding in terms of response times, but they've got to start thinking about how they're doing it more efficiently, getting best practice from each other, and for that we have a number of sector groups to help share good practice, and obviously codes of practice, keeping that alive, helping spread that good practice is always a positive thing. And certainly what we've noticed when we've been bringing on the RSLs into freedom of information, which they came under the Act on the 11th of November. The fact that they've got federations and groups of them, that enabled a lot of standardisation of forms, a lot of standardisation of processes, a lot of discussion between them, and that was very useful, we think, in taking them forward and helping them provide a more consistent approach within that sector.
Thank you for that. Now, sticking with the theme, and you mentioned the fees and the cap earlier on, so I think just to reflect what you said, we have a limit of £600 at £15 an hour, which is 40 hours work. So two questions, if I may. Is there any data on how often the fees cap is used as an exemption? And in any event, do you take a view on whether the cap requires to be reviewed? And if so, to what? And should there, you mentioned the environmental regulations earlier on, should we actually be looking at full cost recovery as with the environmental regulations? There was quite a lot in there, so if you want me to go back and re-ask them individually, I can do.
Yes, so first of all, in relation to the 40 hours and the £600, We do have statistics for how often it's used every year. I don't think we've got them today, but I can certainly provide the committee with that information.
We do know that in 2018-19 a fee was actually charged in 0.08% of all requests, but in terms of how often a complete refusal was issued, we need to come back to you with that data.
That would be very kind, thank you.
But we know it is used. In relation to the cost limit, I think there is a useful discussion to be had as to, is cost the correct measure, or should we just be going on how many hours it takes to provide the information? So should we move, given that we've got a cap of the hourly rate, we've got 40 hours essentially just now in Scotland. In the rest of the UK, it's 20 hours. Where do we want that to be? And I think maybe moving away from cost will get rid of maybe some unnecessary leaps. If at the end of the day we're saying, yeah, we're talking a 40-hour period, let's think about, is 40 hours the right level of work or not? As I say, within the current practice, I think it is working. I think it strikes a sensible balance between, on the one hand, wanting to get as much information out as possible, but on the other hand, recognising that there's a limit to what public costs and finances can do. There are some systems in the world, for example Canada, where there are no limits at all, and that can lead to requests for millions of pages of information, which can cause, as you would imagine, serious issues. So I think at the moment 40 hours strikes a good balance, certainly in favour of pushing out as much information as possible. In relation to the suggestion about full cost recovery and the environmental information regulations, I certainly would not be in favour of full cost recovery, because when one thinks about who is that going to impact, it's going to impact those least able to pay. So in essence, we're going to have your access to information will be dependent upon how deep your wallet is. And I don't think that's in any way an attractive way forward for us in Scotland. I much prefer the concept of the universal right, with people having access to it. As Lorraine's mentioned, the actual occasions on which costs are charged under FOISA, are remarkably low. And I think that's generally, that's a sensible approach.
I just wonder, just a supplemental that occurs, there's a different limit in England, as you raised, Aaron. I wonder if there's a comparison to be done. I wonder what the data would show is the practical impact of having two different limits. But perhaps that's something I'll leave to you.
Yeah, I think the problem is that the rest of the UK doesn't have the statistical information that we have. Right. They're looking at moving towards that, but yes, absolutely, it would be interesting to see what the difference in proportion of cases rejected is. I would imagine it will be significant.
Thank you.
John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think maybe building on the way Liam Kerr has been asking questions, we've had various evidence, I think, from different authorities, and clearly the volume of requests coming in is an issue for some of them. And the suggestion is that some are looking at who's asking the question or why it's being asked, and maybe kind of prioritising a bit. And then the kind of counter suggestion is that it should be applicant blind, purpose blind, and maybe even a request should be anonymised when they come into an authority. Can you give us your thinking on that area?
Yes, certainly I agree with the general approach of the Act, which is that requests for information are applicant blind. It shouldn't matter whether you're a journalist or whether you're a private citizen in making your application. Your request for information, it's public information, you should be entitled to it unless one of the exemptions applies. And indeed, in our intervention into the Scottish Government, that was a point that we made clear, that the decision maker as to whether or not information goes out should not be dictated by the fact that the individual happened to be a journalist or a political researcher. That shouldn't automatically have meant that they had to jump through more processes, causing additional delay in the information coming out. Of course, how information is dealt with within the system, if it's more complex or it's more sensitive, you've got more chance of it being dealt with at the higher levels, and we understand that as well. In terms, the legislation, however, is not completely applicant blind, because there are some reasons why the name, the individual might be relevant, and in particular in relation to vexatiousness. So we may have a situation whereby if a particular individual is making requests for inappropriate motives, has the effect of harassing the authority and the various tests that we would have for vexatiousness, it's appropriate to look at not just in determining whether the one request is vexatious or not, it is appropriate to be able to look at the wider picture, including volumes of requests from that individual and so on. So there are circumstances in which the individual is relevant to the process, I say particularly for vexatiousness. Okay. In relation to the ability to maybe put in requests without any name, there are some practical issues in relation to that. So, for example, how do you then seek a review from that individual? How does that individual then seek an appeal? How can we contact them to make their representations? How can they then go to court and say, my original application was this?
I mean, I have to say I took it as being there would be a kind of gatekeeper, but then whoever looked for the information would do it anonymously, but then it would go back to the gatekeeper, I suppose. But I take your point.
Yes.
I mean, on some of this, we've had some evidence. I mean, Glasgow City Council was saying, for example, commercial enterprises coming in looking for information, it's just a way of them saving money. They don't need to do their own research, so they get Glasgow City Council at public expense to do the research for them. And similarly, I mean, although you've suggested it should be purpose and applicant blind, one individual person who's just wanting this one bit of information, I would kind of rank maybe more highly than a journalist who just has a kind of quiet Friday afternoon and sends in 200 requests to all over the place. Should there not be? And I mean, another suggestion was from some of the health boards that people go through the health board system, not happy with the result, just want to give the health board a kicking. So the way they kick them is by swamping them with requests.
I think you've got two issues there. You've got the issue of who is applying, and on that, I think everybody's equal on that. It's a universal right, and that's, I think, one of the strengths of the system. It's not allowing the authorities to make that subjective call on, is this a worthy individual, is this not a worthy individual? Because they'll all have different views on that. Some will say, well, journalists should have more access to it because they can raise issues at a higher level. Others will say, well, no, it's the individual who's more important. Having a universal right removes any of those barriers and says everybody's treated the same, every request is the same right to the information.
I mean, if the 8%, as Mr. Kerr said, keeps going up and up and up, the health board cannot give treatment to everybody that wants it. The local authority cannot fix every road that needs it. So surely there has to be some prioritisation of these.
Well, I think the next issue then is the request behaviour. So you mentioned being swamped by requests or people contacting the authority to give them a kicking. If we look at that, that's when we come into the realms of is this request vexatious? Is this something that therefore should be blocked and should not need to be responded to? And so we've got the mechanisms in there already to deal with that bad sort of request of behaviour. In terms of prioritising individuals, I wouldn't agree with that. I think it's a universal right. In essence, it's public information. It's information that we've already all paid for. It's information that we've all got the right to receive. And in relation to those areas where they maybe are getting lots of requests for particular types of information from companies, well, are those areas whereby they should be more proactively pushing it out, so it's just out there anyway.
Okay, well, I think my final point would be on this vexatious question, which you've mentioned a couple of times. I think it was Kevin Dunyan had said that actually the vexatious, or not excuse, the reason for not responding because it's vexatious has not actually been used very much by authorities. Is that your feeling as well?
Yes, it has certainly been used, and it is used by authorities. So, for example, we can say that it's in 1819, it was used 175 times by authorities. But obviously in the context of 83,000 requests, that's not a high percentage, so it isn't used much. It is used. I think that's sensible because it's showing it's being used in cases where people really have crossed the line. I think potentially they can use it in more cases than they do. There is a natural reluctance by public authorities to use the vexatious provision, because at the end of the day, we're public authorities. We're there to provide a service to the public. We believe in that. So I think there is a natural reticence to particularly calling people vexatious, even though it's not the person that they're calling vexatious, it's actually the request itself.
Okay, thanks so much.
Willie Coffey.
Very much, Convener. I wonder if I could look at two areas of interest to the committee over recent weeks. First is in this proactive publication area, which you've mentioned yourself already, and the second one is on the duty to record, or the expectation to record certain types of information. Darren, in your submission, you've said that you suggest that, now let me get it right, that the requirement to adopt a publication scheme should be removed and replaced with a statutory duty to publish information. Now, for the ordinary person in the street, could you just explain to us the difference between those and why you think your suggestion would strengthen the Act?
Thank you for that, yes. The duty to have a publication scheme, it's quite an old-fashioned idea. The idea is that you first of all had a bit of paper or a document that you called your publication scheme, and in that publication scheme you set out a number of things, including the classes of information that you were going to provide to people. Underneath that you had another document called your Guide to Information, and that's where you set out everything that you publish under each of those headings. So it's quite an old-fashioned sort of, almost like a paper-based idea of how you might let people know what you're going to proactively publish and what you are proactively publishing. Now, at the original idea of the Act, you know, the concept was that all authorities would have slightly bespoke publication schemes. As time's moved on, it sort of looked at maybe having sectoral schemes, and now we've got to a stage whereby we have a model publication scheme. In other words, we say, this is our idea of what a good publication scheme looks like. It's the model publication scheme. Would you like to sign up to that? And it already sets out the classes of information that we would expect. So like about the authority, what's your procurement information, how you make decisions and what decisions you've made. So it's you know, how we manage our physical and human resources. We've got to that position whereby everybody signs up to our model publication scheme. And it's not really doing, I think, what it was originally intended to do, which is to try to make authorities focus on what's the public interest in information, and we should be pushing out information where there's a public interest in it. So what we're saying is, let's move away from that position of these documents into a position whereby we focus on that publication. You're a public authority, you should be proactively publishing information that where there's a public interest to do so. And by having a code of practice instead, the code of practice can set out the areas that we expect to be included. It can be evolved over time to take into account new technological methods. Perhaps it can include consistency of approach in certain areas, so it could include consistency of approach on how certain information should be published, which helps requester groups. It also helps the authorities themselves because it gives an easier baseline for them to measure the performance against other authorities and to explain what they're doing. So it just becomes a much more agile and more modern way of doing things. And again, it puts the focus not on having a document. It puts the focus on pushing out information to the public.
Okay, but if we introduce a statutory duty to publish information, won't that give rise to people asking, well, what kind of information should we publish? And that brings you back to your list. How do we clear that one up?
And I think the code can provide essentially that list, but it can also do a lot more than just provide the list. It can move proactive publication forward in more ways than just saying, here's the list, provide the information under it. So, for example, some of the things that we currently provide in our guidance, which isn't mandatory, it's good practice, about what should be published under each of those heads. At the moment, I can't, if an authority doesn't do that, I'd have to argue, oh, we've breached your publication scheme duty, and it becomes quite difficult to say, well, does it or doesn't it have to have that bit of information in it? If there's a code setting out these things in a nice, straightforward way, it's much easier to enforce. And again, the focus is on proactive publication. The focus is on making them push the information out. There is currently a duty to publish, but it's a duty to publish information in accordance with your model publication scheme. And I'm saying, well, why we've moved really on from that. It's almost like an extra layer of old-fashionedness that doesn't really add any value and that actually distracts from the key thing, which is the importance of pushing out information.
Yeah, okay, and then therefore kind of introducing the idea that this should be routine rather than covered by guidance and regulation. Is that something we should move towards that? Because there's been discussion at the committee over a period of time saying, why don't we just routinely publish what we have rather than being told to do so? Is that something that you would favour?
Certainly, and that's that cultural shift. But I think you need the regulation behind it sometimes to kickstart that and to make the authorities go down that route. And then once it's then embedded, hopefully it just becomes part of the normal day job, so that when you're in your committee meeting, as you're going through the items, you're saying, yeah, that one of the points on the committee report, yes, we're happy that be published, or we're happy that most of that be published, but not paragraph X because it contains personal data or whatever. And then it just becomes much more organic. It's just how things are done, and it's pushing out more important information to people.
Okay, on the other question about this notional duty to record, we know that there is no such duty within FOISA to record anything, but perhaps there's an increasing expectation amongst the public that there should be, and there should information that perhaps should be available, might be available. What's your view on this debate and this argument? Should there be a duty to document what happens within the public sector and so on?
Yes, it in many ways goes back to the practicality point that I mentioned earlier on, that whatever system you have in place is got to be enforceable, because there's no point in having something that is perhaps so nebulous, a duty that's so nebulous that it can lead to endless arguments about, oh, are you complying? Yes, we're complying, or no, you're not complying. It then becomes almost unenforceable and serves no purpose. So I think if you are looking at a duty to document, I think it's important to have very clear definitions about what it is that should be documented. And it's, without doubt, if the information is not documented, freedom of information is not going to be of use to you. So that's essentially the bottom line. You need bodies, you need public authorities to be recording the information for freedom of information to have its utility. Now, there are obviously currently a number of discrete bits of legislation which require you to record certain things. Particularly if you're a local authority, there are certain discrete bits of legislation requiring certain things to be recorded. For me, the key things that need to be recorded are important decisions within an authority, the rationale for those decisions, and key bits of information that informed those decisions. So if I was looking at, if I was being asked, well, what would you think are the important things that should be recorded? I think decision making is the big one there. And if we look at systems like Denmark, which has got a duty to document, it focuses in on decision making as the area where the document should be. And again, because it's quite discrete, it can be is something that you could legislate in a way that you've got something that's relatively certain, rather than, for example, a provision that says anything of importance to the public must be documented. That's just asking for argument, litigation, and uncertainty. So I would suggest if we are looking at that, and I know there's been thoughts of important meetings with outside interests, or meetings with outside interests being recorded, if that's something the committee thought was an important point, then again, that's something that's relatively straightforward to define and add to a duty. I think there's a big issue on, does it live in freedom of information legislation, or does it live in records management information? And of course, authorities already have their duties under the records management legislation, and then the keeper of the records is responsible for that legislation. And records management plans, they're already a requirement to have those, and to a degree that provides, they can provide a requirement to create information, but as you say, that lives in the records management legislation, not in freedom of information.
Yeah, I was going to come to that because I was going to ask you to distinguish between what is or isn't in FOISA and what the Civil Service Code sets out in terms of the duty to keep accurate and official records. So would you say that we already have the duty but somewhere else, and it doesn't have to be in FOISA, or should we strengthen FOISA to make it adopt aspects of the Civil Service Code to where does it sit?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of duties contained in various places. So, particularly for local authorities, there are a number of discrete statutory duties to record certain things. You've pointed out to the Civil Service Code. There's also the Ministerial Code. So there are a number of codes out there already which do have guidance on some of these areas in saying what should be recorded. The issue then comes if it's not, who's then responsible for dealing with it, and what powers do they have to deal with it, and what sanctions might there be? So it's that issue of who should be responsible for that. Certainly, if it ended up with my office, there would be a significant resource issue associated with it, because it's the sort of area where one would expect a number of lively discussions to take place, and challenges to be received.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Fitzhenry, I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming your job is probably quite concerned with the quality of information as well as the disclosure of information.
It's concerned with the quality of the responses to make sure that the information is pushed out. Okay. Whether or not that information is accurate is another issue. So, for example, the value of freedom of information might be to show that the authority is working on the basis of inaccurate information, and that the information that they hold is not correct.
It's just I'm very aware, with our other hat on in our audit work in this committee, we've recently released a thematic report, and one of the themes in that report is about data that's held by the Scottish Government, and we've discovered that, and I think the Auditor General has identified as well, that there's a real problem with the lack of data, and lack of data that's held on certain things, and lack of information. Do you find that when the public are looking for information, sometimes it may be an important question, but that data is just not held by local authorities, and you might expect it to be?
Yes, we can have situations where that happens, and occasionally in decisions we will express surprise that the information sought was not held. Sometimes it's not held because actually it will be held by another body, and it was mentioned, health was mentioned earlier on. There are so many bodies involved in it that you might just not have the correct body that have identified the correct body that holds it. And as I say, there are sometimes just authorities haven't thought to record that information. And sometimes a freedom of information request can be used to identify that and to make the authority think, oh, well, while they're compiling, why don't we have this information? We should have this information, and that can help improve authority practice.
I have a very current example of an FOI I have submitted myself to all the health boards in Scotland about the number of female spaces in hospitals, because wards are increasingly becoming mixed sex, and female safe spaces are disappearing, and I've been absolutely astonished by the responses, because health boards are simply not recording or not holding this information. Do you think there's an opportunity in the work we are doing to perhaps address that and encourage local authorities to have better information keeping?
Yes, and I think, as I say, that this is one area where freedom of information can help identify areas which should be monitored and that aren't monitored. So, by way of example, if a request like that is made and they realise we're not keeping this information, that's an opportunity for them to say, right, well, let's now keep it. Or a request like that is made and you get different responses from different authorities within the same sector, because they're all recording their information in slightly different ways, or some are recording this information and others aren't. It can help actually just raise the issue, and then the sector as a whole can look at how it looks at recording that information and having a degree of consistency involved in that.
Okay.
The problem is when you've got independent authorities, there will always be a degree of difference in the way that they record information.
Is there anything you'd like to add you feel you've not had the opportunity to address this morning?
The only major point that I would like to mention is interventions and proactive intervention, in particular the ability for my office to help improve the authority practice. So to be able to go to an authority which is performing poorly and to help them improve that performance, particularly, for example, with time delays. We had a recent example with East Lothian Council, which was performing very poorly in relation to its turnaround times. And by way of proactive intervention, we were able to go to them. We were able to identify the problem, go to them, discuss it with them, and help them move forward, which allowed them to put resource into it, allowed them to deal with the issues, and their on-time improvements improved dramatically. I think it's up to around about 99% or something now, having been as low as 70% at stages for late responses. So quite substantial changes, and a greater emphasis on allowing us to do this. The powers that we have to compel witnesses, particularly if we move away from purely public bodies into private bodies carrying out public services, and just a recognition that a bit more resource in that area would be money well spent from an efficiency and effectiveness position. That would be my the point to make.
Thank you very much indeed for your evidence, both of you, this morning. I'm now going to suspend the meeting briefly for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. Item 4 is the Section 23 report on the Scottish Public Pensions Agency, update on management of the PS project. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning: Leslie Evans, Permanent Secretary; Alison Stafford, Director General, Scottish Exchequer; Gordon Wales, Chief Financial Officer; and Colin Cook, Director of Digital from the Scottish Government. I understand the Permanent Secretary has an opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Public Pensions Agency provides pension administration services to over 500,000 retired and contributing members across the NHS, teachers, fire and police, and indeed the Scottish Parliament. The agency has experienced material growth in scheme members over recent years, including successfully taking responsibility for the police and firefighter schemes in 2015. In addition, it's implemented a range of IT and change projects to respond to both UK and Scottish pension reforms and system improvements. The agency's transformation programme was launched 6 years ago in 2013 and comprised 8 major projects. All bar one were implemented successfully. The decision to terminate the one unsuccessful project, integrating pension administration and payment functions, and the subject of our deliberations today, was taken almost 2 years ago in February 2018. This decision was taken only after months of strenuous efforts on the part of the agency to secure a working system from the contracted IT software supplier, Capita. Despite repeated reviews and replannings, Capita failed to deliver any of the project milestones. Your previous evidence session on this report heard that SPPA had undoubtedly extracted and applied important learning from this experience, and the Scottish Government has learned too. We have put in place more robust procedures for the progress of IT projects and are strengthening and clarifying relationships with arm's-length bodies. Procurement regulations have also tightened around areas such as low tenders. But as Audit Scotland's report confirmed, Capita's delivery of the software was fundamental to the success of the project. Now, I must stress that throughout the period under discussion, SPPA maintained collection, administration, and payment to clients, and continues to do so. It's important to emphasise that there has been no risk to the pensions paid by the agency. They continue to be paid on time and in full. The focus has been, and will always be, putting customers first. Audit Scotland's report sets out costs for the life of the project, but the additional costs to SPPA were smaller in practice, closer to 3.8 million, and that also includes significant sums on existing staff that would have been employed anyway, as well as costs to Capita. Cost projections for the future are also very different and dependent on the pace of change. Now, I'm aware that this committee has considered a number of public sector IT projects over the years. The lessons from these projects have shaped current practices and new SG assurance arrangements, and indeed have enabled Audit Scotland to develop very helpful guidance for digital programmes right across the public sector. But it's worth noting that we currently have 410 active IT projects registered with our digital assurance team, of which 27 are classed as major. And in the past year alone, the Scottish Government and its agencies have delivered several new IT projects and systems successfully, including the upgrade to Revenue Scotland's tax and administrative system, several new benefits within Social Security Scotland, improvements to our core shared service platform, and the creation of 2 new forestry agencies. Finally, Convener, as the accountable officer answerable to the Parliament, the Chief Executive of the agency will always be best placed to answer detailed questions. And you'll be aware that much of the information and paperwork pertaining to this project is archived, so we may have to come back to you on points of particular detail. But I'm here today with my colleagues to assist the committee with its scrutiny of this project.
Thank you very much, Permanent Secretary. I know you will be aware, and you mentioned it yourself, that we did hold a previous evidence session on that. The committee wasn't satisfied with the answers that we received at that session, and that's why we've invited you along today as the person in charge of the Scottish Government. Indeed, the Chief Executive to the SPPA was new and so didn't have a detailed knowledge of what had gone on before. So we're hoping that we can get clarity on some of these issues today. I'm going to ask Willie Coffey to open questioning for the committee.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, everybody. You're well aware, of course, that the committee has seen a number of IT projects coming to our attention, and we tend to ask the same questions every time we get these reports. There's a similarity within all of them about failure to adopt recognised software development management standards and practices and quality assurance. It seems perhaps that this is another example of that. So could you just set in context why you think the failures in this particular one took place and whether those adopted and recognised management standards were in place for this particular project?
So Colin may want to say something specific about the nature of the technical aspects of the software. I think it's important to remember here that SPPO have their own board, their own accountable officer, and they're ultimately responsible as a decision-making body in their own right. So they were very clear from the beginning about what their roles and responsibilities were and what they were seeking for. We can talk in a little while about the support that we gave them through that process. But they did follow a very clear procurement process, which was governed by the Public Contracts Scotland Regulations 2012 at the time. They've since changed, in fact, so the way in which this would be procured now and the nature of that process would be quite different. I think the other thing to be clear about here is that SPPA received support from the Scottish Government in the form of the procurement section that we have and indeed our own lawyers. But their own decision-making process was one which was based on a very rigorous testing of the tender by Capita. And indeed, a number of companies came forward on the basis of the procurement process that they put out, the descriptions of what was required. In those days, it was a 70-30 split in terms of quality and in terms of prices, and Capita scored very well on that. So I don't know if Colin wanted to say anything more about the specifics of this, and indeed perhaps a little bit about how it would be different now if we were looking to go through, as we are, the same process.
Yes, I mean we've discussed on a few occasions the new principles and the new approach we've introduced across the Scottish Government and with the support and guidance of Audit Scotland. If a major project of this nature would now need to be registered with the internal audit team that oversees digital projects, it would be subject to mandatory justification gates throughout the lifetime of the project. And there would be a set of guidance available to the people running the project, a set of resources available for them to call on, and a set of standards known as the Digital First Standards, which summarise both the need in order to ensure that user needs are well understood before the project starts, the technology that should be used or the approach to procuring or developing the technology, and the issues that sometimes arise about ensuring that you have the capability and capacity within the team, both to develop the project, but also to sustainably improve any service that emerges after it goes live.
Thank you for those remarks, but could I ask you though, software development methodologies have been around for ages and ages. They're fairly well established in industry, but here's an example where they just didn't seem to apply. And now they will. You know, the question a lot of the committee members have been asking for a number of months, years in fact, is why does this happen with a project like this, given that standards have been in place for so long? It's as though this one slipped under the radar and we didn't notice it. And that's common. That's a common feeling I think that members will share here. So suddenly when we get a failure like this, we go, oh, we're applying new standards to it. But the standards have been around for a long time. Why weren't they applied in this case?
Colin, can I just say one thing before Colin comes back on that, on the more specific aspects of this? I think the other thing that we need to remember here is that we had a bid which was from a very experienced contractor, very experienced, not just in software, but actually in pensions specifically, and is still delivering pensions contracts within the UK and possibly beyond. It was tested very robustly. We may want to talk further on about how that happened, that process. But in terms of asking Capita and pressing very robustly and rigorously on Capita's preparedness and capacity to address and deliver on this project. I think the Chief Executive at the time was very well experienced, but also very timely in the way that he took extra time to test out, unnecessarily in terms of the procurement regulations at the time, but extra time to test out Capita's capacity, experience, and particularly on the pricing of the bid. So although I understand your frustration with regard to particular software projects, and Colin can talk a little bit more about how we are evolving and how we have developed our approach to that, there is a contractual compliance issue here which we should not forget. We may want to talk a little bit more about later on.
Do you mind if I intervene just at this point? Permanent Secretary, it's just an interesting response because it's my understanding that the Auditor General reported that the SPPA responded that it did not have the skills to further probe the tender. That's quite contrary to what you've just said.
Well, SPPA were, of course, looking to probe the tender across a whole range of areas. And they asked, my understanding is, though, I think there's a bit of confusion about how the exchange with, I think it was the legal advisors in the Scottish Government where this exchange took place. The discussion that...
The exchange between
SPPA
and Capita?
No.
No.
No. There was an exchange. There were many exchanges between SPPA and Capita.
Yes.
I think there has been, if I remember the report correctly, a discussion about when SPPA felt it was appropriate to keep pursuing Capita and along what line. Now, my assertion here and the evidence that we have, and I think both Alison Stafford and others, probably Gordon as well, have seen the raw material of all of this, is that the Chief Executive not only sought legal advice, but asked about written clarification from Capita about their costings, about how many data migrations they had experience of across public and private sector schemes, about their ability to deliver economies of scale, and about actually their view that they wanted to grow the market for them in Scotland, and therefore this was one of the reasons why their tenders were as they were. They also wanted to know what they would need to do, SPPA, if they felt that the tender was too low, in other words, that it was not robust enough. And that was the part of the conversation that I believe they undertook with experts within the Scottish Government.
Okay, but you're suggesting there that the contract was probed further. Now, the Auditor...
The tender, yes.
Sorry,
yeah.
The tender. The Auditor General has said that the SPPA themselves responded that they did not have the skills to further probe the tender. So that indicates that there was no further probing done. And then the report goes on to indicate that SPPA took no further action before accepting Capita's bid.
SPPA tested the tender rigorously. They also, I know, had some very specific technical issues that they wanted to consider with Capita. And I think that was the conversation that we're talking about here. At no time were we asked for any further support by SPPA on the probing of the tender because it was so fundamentally and characteristically, I think, given the Chief Executive's experience, thorough in testing. And I'm not aware of any aspect of the tender which and probing of the tender which would make a difference to the fact that Capita were going to fulfil that programme or not.
So why did the SPPA say to the Auditor General that they didn't have the skills to further probe the tender? Are you saying that actually the case was they didn't need to probe the tender further, it was all done?
I think they did probe the tender very seriously, and more than one might have expected given the regulations in place at that time. I think if they felt they needed to gather more information or more experience, they could have come to the Scottish Government for that. I'm not aware that they did or didn't do that, but I don't know if colleagues want to come in on that at all.
Very happy to do so. I think the key things are about sort of the history of the tender and with Capita. That actually started way back in 2014. There was a pre-qualification questionnaire that was issued. Various people, various suppliers responded to that. Capita was one of those. And that showed that there were no grounds for concern in terms of their financial or their capability of actually taking part ultimately in the tender. Obviously, then there was the actual tender bids that were submitted by the due date in March 2015. Capita, and alongside all the other bids that were submitted, actually went through a rigorous test at that particular point in time to then rank the position of all of the bids that had come in. As the Permanent Secretary has already said, that was based 70% on quality, 30% on cost. The key thing in respect of that process was actually to work through what is known as the, it has the abbreviation of MEET, but it stands for the most economically advantageous tenderer. So it actually is the whole package that's taken into account. As part of the whole process then that is followed through, it's important, and the agency did go through due process. They actually carried out some further scenario tests. So there was 3 particular scenarios which each of the bidders were asked to work through. These were very specific ones about demonstrating processes, or how members would apply for benefits online, or how a calculation from a receipt of mail would go through right to the final stage. You know, there's some very detailed things. Those were all tested. Capita came out on top for all of those presentations. And there were further checks that were done. As Permanent Secretary said, those further checks, this level of due diligence was not actually required by the tendering regulations that were in place at that time, but they were carried out. And that was to ensure that the bid was not an abnormally low tender. And that's for the Capita to demonstrate that the bid was both genuine and serious. They responded to that, and they were seen by the accountable officer at the agency, the judgment that was made that the bid was a genuine and serious bid.
Okay.
I think it's important for us to remember that what happens in procurement exercises is both a highly regulated and also a commercial activity that takes place. Companies that compete and take place in a tender exercise will make a whole range of judgments as to how they want to take part in that. And part of the testing on a low bid is to make sure that actually that the requirements of the contract are absolutely understood. Those contract terms were actually ones that were supported by the Scottish Government Legal Department to make sure that that was rigorously drafted. And so Capita were able to demonstrate to the accountable officer that they were not weak in terms of actually understanding what the contract was that was required. We were also alive to the fact that maybe a supplier could choose to exploit, once they've put a low bid in, that they could come back during the term of the contract and exploit to try and make good. But also there's some real decisions about tenderers who may actually want to get into a market and they're willing to put forward a different price. That is not unusual in a commercial scenario. We do have other examples, not specifically necessarily around IT, but there are other examples in Scotland where we have had suppliers and successful tenderers who have gone on, that we have let contracts to, who have put forward their materials in terms of a lower than what might be seen as the price, so that they can actually get a market share. And for some companies, they are willing to enter into market just so that they don't actually have fallow periods or have staff that aren't being deployed.
I think we appreciate that scenario you've gone on to describe can happen, Ms Stafford, but I'm more concerned about the first part of your answers, because they stand in direct contrast to paragraphs 14 and 15 in the Auditor General's report. In direct contrast. I mean, you said Capita came out on top in every one. The Auditor General said they scored second for quality, first for cost and first overall.
So the Auditor General's report I agree with in terms of the ranking against quality and cost. But what I'm saying is in terms of the further tests that were done, that were applied to all bidders, which there was 3 scenarios that each actually had to present against.
Okay, well, let me...
So this is a further, so this is beyond the 70% and the 30% on quality and cost. Even beyond that, there were some further exercises that were done that were applied to all bidders at the same time. So it actually was, again, a competitive process. And on those 3 scenario testings, Capita came out on top.
Okay, I think we're all agreed that their bid was the lowest, but paragraph 15 stands in direct contrast to what you and the Permanent Secretary have described this morning. Let me read it to you. As SPPA classed Capita's bid as abnormally low, it was required to investigate whether it was a valid bid. SPPA queried elements of the bid with Capita and discussed Capita's responses with the Scottish Government Legal Department, who advised that more in-depth questions should be asked to fully assess the bid. SPPA informed the Scottish Government Legal Department that it did not have the skills to further probe the tender. The SPPA then took no further action and accepted the bid and reassurances from Capita over its ability to deliver. That is not what... Do you accept the Auditor General's account of this?
So what I do know is that the SPPA had to determine whether or not the bid that came forward from Capita was genuine and serious. That was the overarching test that they had to do. They conducted due diligence on that. Again, that was not required at the time, but they chose and absolutely did that as part of following that through. And they were able to seek the clarifications they sought from Capita, gave them the assurance that they needed that the bid that had come forward was genuine and serious, and that's the overarching test.
So what's your reaction to the fact that SPPA said they didn't have the skills to ask the necessary questions?
So, I mean, obviously that's what
Do you
is
accept
on,
that?
I see that that is what's actually on the record.
But you don't accept it?
So I know ultimately, overall, there is a judgment that had to be exercised by the accountable officer in terms of the contracts and the bids that came forward. And on balance across all of those bids, and the due diligence was reasonable in terms of what was done on Capita, that actually they saw that actually all the assurance they'd had up to that point were actually sufficient for them to make a decision.
I think the point is, and I think this is an important point, that I don't think that issue, and we've seen it in the report, makes a fundamental difference to Capita's capacity to deliver on that contract. Capita failed from the first milestone, the first project milestone, to deliver on that project. They were, from very early on, indicating concerns and difficulties on their part about being able to deliver.
Would you accept that your government failed to check them out properly?
I accept that the Chief Executive and his team and the board, as the accountable officer and the deciding factor, i.e. the person who takes a decision, did everything that they could. In fact, did more than was required to check out.
But they didn't, because they said they didn't have the skills to ask the right questions.
Well, I don't know where that comment came from.
It came from the Auditor General.
Well, I mean in terms of SPPA, ultimately it was for the Chief Executive to probe every aspect that he felt was appropriate in letting that contract, and to advise on that basis his board, and to take the decision that this contract had been tested to well, not quite to destruction, but the tender was very heavily tested and way over and above what was required for procurement at that time. Are we saying that there is one element that led Capita to fail to produce the contract and to fulfil the contract? I think that's something that Capita would need to be asked about.
But, yeah, well, your officials said they didn't have the skills to ask them. That's part of the problem here.
SPPA said that they might not have had, as far as I can remember from the text in Audit Scotland, and I can't understand what the context of that comment was.
They didn't say they might not have had. They informed the Scottish Government Legal Department that the agency did not have the skills to further probe the tender. That's the exact wording. Willie Coffey, my sincere apologies. Would you like to come back in? Because I know other colleagues want to probe this a little further as well.
Thanks, Jerry. Just briefly back to the software, which didn't work. It's my experience for a number of years in IT that if you adopt and apply a recognised development standard, you're quite likely to get things right. What standard was applied in this project? Development standard. What software development methodology was applied here?
In this particular instance, I think what we saw from the reviews that took place was that there was a weakness in the way in which the programme was developed by the contractor, and weaknesses in the way in which the pensions agency was skilled and able to oversee the development of the project. What I can assure you is that if this was starting now, the way in which the assurance processes would work, the way in which our support that we could provide to the SPPA, and actually, as they're going forward, are engaging with that support, and the standards with which we are operating, would insist upon and require us to follow a recognised methodology, whether that's a standard sort of waterfall type project for the programme, or more likely, in this case, I suspect, some form of agile project development. I can also assure you that the training that's required in order to promote those standards is also in place. We've launched a skills academy, Scottish Digital Academy, which has trained over 1,800 people now in these kind of processes. So we're managing to train both the practitioners who are responsible for delivering the projects, but also the senior managers and the directors of organisations to give them a better understanding of the kind of ways in which software should be developed.
Right, that's a good answer, Colin, but what it tells me is there was no software development standard applied in this project, and that's what I'm trying to get at. They've been known about for a long, long time, and this one seemed to escape the clutches of recognised development methodologies, and nobody noticed until it was too late, and we lost £8 million as a result. £8.7 million was mentioned by the Auditor General, 700,000 of which was returned by capital. It's just that we might as well say that. If there was no standard applied, then let's just say so. If we're correcting that and where we now apply it, because this is the message that's been going on here for a long time now, the adoption of recognised IT development standards must be priority, must be. And I think from what you're saying, and I'm encouraged by what you've said there, it's now in place, but it just wasn't in this project.
Yes, and I think you saw from the way in which the reviews took place that there was a willingness at the beginning of the process to try and put this project back on an even keel and start to introduce some of the disciplines that one would expect. And time was given for that to happen. And then the way in which the review process was carried out set some milestones, set some anticipated gates that we would expect people to have met. And when those didn't happen, the new, as it was at the time, new audit and assessment process was robust enough to say this is no longer a project that we can support, and the Chief Executive took the decision on that basis. So I think I can offer you confidence that we are in a different place now, both in terms of skills and methodologies and capabilities within the organisation. But clearly this is a project that did not work, and as a consequence, we've learned from it and we're moving on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mira. Sorry to be pedantic, but coming back to paragraph 15, clearly SPPA had concerns about aspects of this bid, and they queried aspects of it. They raised some of Capita's responses with the Scottish Government Legal Department, who agreed there was a problem, and came back and asked SPPA to ask more in-depth questions. To which SPPA said they didn't have the skills to do that. And they told the legal department they didn't have the skills to do that. What did the legal department do?
I can't speak on behalf of the legal department in those days. I think the legal department would probably say, we have given you our advice. If you need further support or further skill sources, there are places within the Scottish Government where those could be sourced, depending on what the actual specific element was. This was a very technical project, of course, and some of this, the advice that was given at that time from the Scottish Government was predominant to do with procurement and the legal aspects of procurement. So it wouldn't have necessarily been the lawyers who would be able to either spot or answer what that issue was. Depending on how technical it was, and I don't know if we know how technical it was, but Gordon may be able to help me out on this. If it was a particularly technical aspect of the software, going back to Mr. Coffey's previous conversation, that wouldn't have necessarily been something that the law department for us or the procurement department would have been able to help them on, but we would have been able to send them somewhere else to try and see if we could, not least Colin Cook's predecessors in terms of IT and our technology side of things. Not to my knowledge did we receive a bid for that kind of information or support, but we gave masses of support in other areas and continued to throughout the project. So this one element, I do not think, though I understand within the paragraph that it's being cited, that it's important for you to probe that. Are you saying to me, do I think that that particularly is to do with or is at the core of why this project failed? No, I don't.
I think it's rather more indicative of why the project failed. It's a multiple series of failures throughout. And this is just one aspect of it. I mean, I would have expected somebody in the legal department to have the intelligence when they got this response from SPPA to say there's a problem here. Or do they just file it and that's it? I mean, they have a corporate responsibility.
Indeed they do, and I would not demur from that at all. And I would like to think that now, if something of that nature came up, because we all have a corporate responsibility for ensuring that projects and the organisation delivers on projects, whether we're in the Scottish Government or in arm's length organisations. Of course, the decision to proceed with the tender and the decision to accept it was still the Chief Executive's decision based on all the information that he had at that time, information from the Scottish Government in a supporting capacity and from his own officers.
So it would be the Chief Executive that would take the actual active decision to take no further action, because that is a decision.
Yes, that would be his operational responsibility and that's his accountability. So he would have weighed up all the information that was in front of him, having, as Alison described, tested almost to destruction the nature of that tender, having also had contact with our procurement side of things and the legal side of things, and taken on the basis of all of that, does this feel like the right kind of tender for the project that we have described?
Would there be documentary evidence of the decision as to why it was taken?
I'm sure there would be documentary evidence because it would have been submitted to the board. I don't have the minutes with me, but some of us, we may be able to find that for you.
It could be interesting to see that.
Okay.
Permanent Secretary, forgive me, but I'm really confused by some of these answers, because you're saying that the Chief Executive tested to destruction. They didn't test to destruction, because it says here again in paragraph 15 that the SPPA queried elements of the bid with Capita and discussed Capita's responses with the Scottish Government Legal Department, who advised that more in-depth questions should be asked to fully assess the bid. So your own government, the Legal Department, told the SPPA that they needed to ask more questions. So the Chief Executive at the time could never have been under the impression that he had tested things to destruction before he then decided to go on and accept the bid. So why do you say that?
Because the Chief Executive is the accountable officer and responsible for taking this decision. He has to look at, or she, in certain circumstances, has to look at all the information that is amassed, the information that they have taken on the basis of the various stages of tendering that Alison described, the probing that they have undertaken, and also, of course, take into account what came out of that probing. And depending on how technical or how financial or on the basis of quality and presentation and so on, he then has to make a recommendation that he thinks that this is the right tender to accept. Now,
but you said it had been tested to destruction. Your own legal department said it hadn't been. There were still further questions to ask.
In the context of the regulations and the procurement process at that time, the investigations that the Chief Executive undertook at that time were not required. They were not required. Now, they would be, and a bid of this kind probably, though Colin could probably advise me on this, would not be accepted. The regulations have changed. This is back in several years ago when they were quite different.
But your legal department advised them that they were required, that they did need to ask. Who advised that more in-depth questions should be asked to fully assess the bid?
If I could perhaps interject just for a second. So the legal department reviewed the responses that Capita had made and described them as reasonable responses. It then suggested that a further question could be asked. It didn't tell them, and it didn't dictate that they should ask further questions. And again, I re-emphasise that their assessment was that the questions Capita had been asked thus far they had provided reasonable responses.
Okay, so you're saying there, Mr. Wales, that paragraph 15 in the Auditor General's report is not worded all that accurately.
Well, it may very well be that the SPPA wasn't in a position to be able to ask further technical questions, but the reality is that the Chief Executive...
No, it doesn't say that. It says the legal department, Scottish Government's legal department, advised that more in-depth questions should be asked.
Certainly the evidence I've seen is that the legal department suggested that further questions could be asked. I realise there's a subtle difference in there.
There's a difference between could and should.
But ultimately this comes back to, as the Permanent Secretary said, was the accountable officer satisfied that the probing that had been carried out to that point was reasonable to satisfy him that this was a serious bid? And the decision that he took was that it was.
Took that decision that it was, despite the fact he'd been advised that more questions needed to be asked.
Could be asked.
Said should here. Should. That's the Auditor General's report. Said
That's
should
our
be asked.
understanding of it. It was could, not should. Could be asked. But
Okay.
we have only a limited amount of information to go on going back over the years, but we do have some which indicates could.
Okay, well, the Auditor General sitting behind you will hear in our next session what her take on that is. Why didn't the Scottish Government intervene at this point?
Well, the Scottish Government was in a position to support the accountable officer's role in testing the tender. And the chief executive of the organisation of the agency would come to us and tell us, which I think he did, to say that my intention is to accept this tender. And there is a process which is then triggered by that decision. So at no point did the chief executive, to my knowledge, though I'm not the most detailed, not familiar with the most detail of this process, but at no time did the chief executive, to my understanding, say, come and tell me whether I should take this bid or not. If that had been the case, we would have had a conversation about that. But Alison, you can tell me if that process did go through.
So what I can add is that obviously there is a very specific process that is followed for all procurements. And that procurement process is obviously so that it is carried out in the diligence is applied to all bids on an equal basis. So Capita came out overall based on the different scorings of the 70 and the 30, arriving at the most economically advantageous bid overall. And also from those further tests of the 3 scenarios, it came out top. And from all the further diligence that was taken to ensure that the bid was not an abnormally low tender, so Capita was asked to provide clarification and assurance that their submitted costs were accurate and sustainable through the term of the contract, and Capita were able to confirm that their bid was accurate and allowed for their required margins and contingency. So all of those factors are the things that the accountable officer at the agency took into account in reaching a judgment. Both and the other thing I think that's important.
Okay, no, let me. You've had Colin to answer my question. Let me just clarify that. I accept, and Auditor General's clear, that the chief executive of the SPPA went ahead and accepted the contract. We're not quibbling about that. My question to you is, why didn't the Scottish Government intervene at that point when that same chief executive had called the legal department and said, I don't have the necessary skills to get under the skin of this?
So it wasn't the chief executive that...
Well, whoever, the SPPA got in touch with the Scottish Government's legal department and said, we don't have the skills to get under this. Why didn't you intervene at that point? I've never run a government, Ms Stafford, but if somebody was to say to me, we've got a huge contract here, huge public money, I'm not actually sure if I've got the staff that are qualified to ask the appropriate questions here, I think that would ring alarm bells for me, and I'd want to send someone in to try and sort it out.
So the chief executive at the time actually had the skills and track record. He'd come from running actually a £15 billion pension operation with...
So despite the fact they told you that they didn't have the skills to ask the questions, you were happy to just let them go ahead and accept the contract?
So the chief executive of the pensions agency had the skills to reach the judgment overall. He had done due diligence. He had got, again, from the Scottish Government Legal Department, an assurance that of all of the various assurances he'd sought specifically on Capita were actually ones that would support going ahead on the contract. Yes, there was this further element about just asking for a further question.
Okay, so
but
what did you...
So it's not that it couldn't be probed at all. It was thoroughly probed.
Okay, so what did your legal team say in response when the SPPA came and said, we need help with this, we don't have the skills to ask the appropriate questions? How did the legal team respond?
So I'll just ask Gordon to respond on this one.
So can I go back just a further stage?
Answer that question, that would help me.
Yes, and I am looking at the correspondence. The legal department did not insist that they went back. It provided them with advice on additional questions they could ask, but again I go back to the point about the legal department confirming that the responses that had been provided thus far were reasonable, and it provided advice on additional questions they could ask if they wanted to.
Okay.
So I want to be specifically clear on that point.
And your legal department weren't concerned that that this was, you know, there was this lack of clarity, and thought that they should maybe flag it up further up the tree and maybe get intervention?
Again, they deemed the responses reasonable, but provided additional advice on additional areas that could be probed if the agency wished to do that.
Okay. What would happen now in the same scenario, Permanent Secretary?
Well, as I've said, I don't think this tender would have got to the stage that it has for reasons that Colin has described. So the procurement process is completely different. And there would be less as well pressure in terms of some of the conditions that we were experiencing at that time, or SPPA was considering at that time. If a chief executive, or indeed one of the chief executive's officials, and I think it's important just to put as a sort of sidebar to this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The chief executive had regular contact with his line manager. He had regular contact through the phaser figure, who was attending meetings and received paperwork. So the conversations and the tendering process that we're talking about now were taking place not in a separate vacuum, but actually as part of a regular contact between the chief executive of the agency and indeed some of his staff, our staff and his line manager, and indeed on occasions with ministers as well. So that would still be in place now, of course. We would have a very different set of testings and assurances, which Colin has just been outlining. And as part of that, there would be an equally, but much more in-depth and rigorous assessment of the nature of the contact within the procurement guidelines that now exist, which are quite distinctly different from the ones that were in operation then.
Okay. When was the contract awarded?
Yeah, October 2015.
Okay, so all the discussion of the contract had been ongoing for how long before that?
It would have been in the months prior to that, during that year.
So the bids were due in a date in March. The date was just adjusted slightly, but it was 2015 was when the bids were due in. And then there was reviews that took place through that time.
Okay. If I can refer you to Exhibit 1 in the Auditor General's report, which is page 10, it gives us a timeline of the leadership and governance of the SPPA. I'm sure it sounds like you've read the official report from our previous evidence session. The committee probed this in quite a lot of detail, because the conversations that we have just covered all took place when there was quite serious hiatus at the top of the SPPA. So you're saying the contract bids were due in March 2015. The permanent chief executive, who'd been there for 13 years, left the following month in April 2015. There was a chief executive. There was then a 3-month gap with an interim chief executive who left in June 2015. There was a permanent chief executive appointed in July 2015, and then that chief executive was pulled into the Scottish Government, I understand, to work on another project until September 2016, and the agency was left with a senior responsible officer. Permanent Secretary, given what we've just covered about questions that needed to be asked on this contract, big question marks over the contract, do you think the lack of leadership at the top of this agency had anything to do with that?
I need to correct some of those points. There has always been an accountable officer and a chief executive officer in place at all times for the SPPA. In fact, Ross Pattison took up post in May 2015, and he was in place for 2 years and saw the concluding stages of the evaluation through of the tendering. He saw through the contract award in October 2015. He was also the person who was wrestling with Capita to try and ensure that the project stayed on track and that they were able to deliver. He was also responsible for having to, because Capita failed to do that, extend the current contract to make sure that there was provision and that customer care and customer focus was maintained. He did at one point go for, I think, about 3 months to work partly for the Scottish Government, but he retained his responsibility as chief executive of the agency and as accountable officer. That was agreed with the chair of the Management Advisory Board and indeed with the Cabinet Secretary of the time. And he maintained responsibility for that project throughout those 3 months, 12 weeks. He attended all the project boards during that time. He was the key player overseeing and indeed was the key player in all his contact with Capita during those 3 months. So I would contest the assertion that there was a lack of continuity. There were some personal circumstances which we had to adjust to and to address, but in all cases we were trying to ensure that we had a balance between business continuity and, of course, duty of care as an employer, and we don't need to go into what those circumstances were.
No, indeed. Well, why, when you've got such an important contract at such considerable public expense, such a big project ongoing, why would you give somebody a second job in government as this was? Why wouldn't you leave them there and let them properly manage what's going on?
So I spoke earlier on about the balance between business continuity and the importance of delivery and personal circumstances and our duty of care as an employer. Taking into account all of those circumstances, we decided that the best thing to do was to get a working arrangement which de-risked the tension between those two, and that meant that Mr. Patterson was working for the government for a certain period of time on a particular project which Alison can describe, and where he had very valuable and important experience, but continue to be responsible for, oversee and drive the delivery of the IT project. Now, I can go into a few more details about the personal circumstances.
I don't want any personal circumstances. I didn't even think it was necessary to mention anyone's name here.
It's important because it was one of the reasons why we slightly changed the configuration of responsibility at the agency at that time. And so the deputy was in charge of day-to-day activity in the agency, but Ross Patterson retained AO responsibilities, chief executive responsibilities, and indeed responsibility for this project. There was no doubt about that.
Permanent Secretary, would you not agree with me that it seems odd that if you've just signed a contract and there were issues about awarding the contract and that are clearly set out in paragraph 15, that you would then give somebody a second job on top of overseeing that very important job at the same time?
We don't want to get into personal circumstances.
I'm not asking you to get into
No, but you are
personal...
doing by the question that you're asking, I'm afraid. I'm not going to go into what they are, but we had to ensure that in order to maintain the continuity of business and that the chief executive was able to continue to give devote his important time to leading and indeed project managing this important piece of IT development, that in order to facilitate him doing that, working a little closer to his home and supporting an important project which Alison can describe was a good business solution to that. And it combined business continuity, because he still was in charge of that project, with duty of care as an employer.
Okay, well, you left us in an awkward position here because I would be the last person who'd want to dive into anyone's personal circumstances. But it seems an odd way to deal with duty of care to me to give somebody a second job, no matter where that job would exist.
It wasn't a second job. It wasn't a second job. It was another part of work which supplemented what he was doing, because he wasn't in charge of the day-to-day running of the agency anymore. He was in charge of this project and had oversight in AO and chief executive responsibilities. I just don't want it to be confused in any
So
way.
why would you want to change the person at the top of the organisation in the middle of such a critical project?
We sometimes have to take decisions about where a duty of care responsibility and supporting our individuals and where they work, the place and location of their work and their working pattern, where we can ensure that that does not put projects at risk, which this didn't, but enables us to be responsible employers.
Okay, thank you. Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. At a previous session, if I can move on to governance, Permanent Secretary, I asked some questions about the Audit Committee, and just in brief summary, I had some difficulty finding out from the website who the Audit Committee were, and found that their minutes were subsumed into the minutes of, I think, the Management Committee. and that only recent ones were on the website and you had to email to get previous ones, which we did, and I don't think we've actually received. So I just wanted to ask you that, when you receive a report like this, a Section 23 report, do you ask yourself, what were the Audit Committee doing, and are they fit for purpose?
Of course, we reflect on reports like this very seriously. And indeed, you will tell from the sessions that you have had that we think very carefully about what the learning is around all of this. The Audit Committee did meet. In fact, I believe it was attended by our Fraser figure responsibilities. And we also know that we had officials who were attending the management boards and the Audit Committee and the project boards very regularly as well. So we know that we had a government responsibility through the Fraser figure to be in touch with the governance and assurance of the SPPA. And if we feel as a result of this report that they need to be tightened, that will be one of the things that the SPPA will be responding to in due course.
I mean, I don't know that they met and reported because I haven't been able to see the earlier reports. And
okay.
I don't know if you have to look at that yourself.
I would have to ask colleagues here if they have, although much of the information is archived, as you might understand. However, the one thing that I would say, which I think will be helpful to you, is we have our own Scottish Government Assurance and Audit Committee meeting next week on the 10th of December. This report and the SPPA's response to the report and our own government response to the report, including some of the issues that you've been asking me about today, will be considered at that stage, and we will then take further advice and deliberations about what we need to do to change within the Scottish Government circumstances in our relationship with arm's length bodies. And SPPA, I know, has already shared with you some of the changes that they have made as a result of their deliberations on the report.
I mean, I don't want to broaden this into other audit committees, but I know the Auditor General had comments about your own government's audit committee, and I have a concern that we have issues raised across a number of reports that we've seen about what the audit committee were doing. So I really would like to know that you have looked at this one, and when you get a Section 23 report, you do ask yourself and satisfy yourself that this committee is now at least fit for purpose.
Yeah, and I know Alison will want to talk about this. I mean, one of the things that we have asked SPPA to do is to ensure that they reflect in their comprehensive response to the Audit Scotland report, and that will include the governance and assurance arrangements that they had in place then and have in place now.
But if the organisation itself has had an issue and a problem, can you just rely on them to say the Audit Committee is functioning properly?
It will be for them in the first instance, which they are doing, to look at the nature of this report and what it says about their audit and risk practices, and Alison may want to say something about that in a little while. It is also for us to ensure that we are playing our role in relation to an arm's length body with an accountable officer and its own board, and to ensure that there is no room for things to fall between those two stools on audit and risk capacity. Alice, I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Certainly, just around the Audit and Risk Committee at the Scottish Public Pensions Agency. So that was in place during this time. It met in terms of its schedule that you would expect it to
This
meet.
is going back to 2014, something
Yes.
like that? Yes.
Yeah, so it did meet. It was populated, as you would expect, with non-executive directors, and officials were in attendance. Other people that would be in attendance at those meetings throughout would be internal audit services, and also Audit Scotland were in attendance, would be in attendance throughout that time as well. In terms of the non-exec directors who were part of that, then there were people which would have had experience, and this continues through to today, of both financial experience, both of large scale in the public sector and also private sector experience that they would have brought in. They would have experience of actually being accountable officers themselves, so they would understand that. And also there was someone who was only recently stood down, completed their term of office, who actually also had private sector specific pension industry experience actually from Edinburgh. And that was helpful because as well as this one project that we're talking about, there was another 7 other projects that were going on. That was implementing not only changes that Scottish ministers wished to see, as the Permanent Secretary has already said, bringing in the over between 20 and 30,000 firefighters and police pensions, but also implementing the Hutton reforms from 2011, which was a UK government requirement.
So I mean, you have the benefit of having seen this. Can you tell us then, did the Audit Committee flag up these issues, or did it sort of fly past them?
So the Audit Committee was briefed about the projects. There was a programme overall. So as I say, the transformation programme ran from 2000, it was programmed to run.
Did they raise issues that somebody presumably ignored?
So they scrutinised at each stage, and they were equally sort of testing about how Capita was actually to deliver on the contract. So that the main issues were really around as not after the contract had been let, but actually as the lack of contract delivery. And to come back specifically to Mr. Coffey's question earlier on, just to be very specific, Colin actually wasn't able to say specifically about the software development. But we do know that, just from some other material...
Would it be helpful if I add? So this directly addresses Mr. Coffey's comment. So this is from the November 2016 independent first review of the project, and it states that Capita are using a waterfall approach to development and apply recognised international standards to the development process. That's an independent report.
So I realised we needed to specifically address your question. So the issues of the Audit and Risk Committee were about the non-delivery of Capita in terms of what was required at particular points in time. The first stages of the contract, Capita did deliver on various elements, but it was in July, end July, early August in 2016, where there was a particular element of that software supply, which when it was applied to user acceptance testing within the agency, and that's why the agency staff are considered as part of this project cost, because they were the ones that were actually testing the software. They were the ones with the experience and knowledge, and were used to using previous systems and the reforms that they were bringing in. It was at that point when the success rate of the calculations that software generated were not satisfactory. And so the Audit and Risk Committee were actually briefed and aware. And the project board then intensified its activities in terms of holding Capita to account, and hold the supplier to account through this process.
So did the Audit Committee raise issues such as the continuity of the management at the top of the agency?
Not to my knowledge, because it was a managed handover. So there was a short period between the chief exec, who stood down at the end of March 2015, and there was just a short period, and there was an interim management. There was a handover that was done, and then there was a long handover between that interim chief exec and the substantive one being appointed. So the committee and those members who also would have a link into the Management Advisory Board were actually cited on that and recognised the actions that were being taken.
Well, I mean, perhaps as one takeaway from this, I mean, it's hard to argue with you because I couldn't see the actual reports. Will these be made available going forward? No, I don't just mean historically, but they're ongoing reports.
So I'm sure we can arrange to share the historical ones, but
on
in
their
terms
website,
of
I don't necessarily
I'm sure
want
that
them myself.
SPPA would want to dwell on this and to ensure that they have the right kind of information on their website. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning, and Convener was asking about the short period of time when the chief executive of SPPA was working on a financial project as well as having oversight of the project. That was agreed by the Management Advisory Board, so it wasn't as if this was being carried out separately from that. They were aware of that.
Just one final point, as a more general point. So you get a Section 23 report. Do you ask yourself, what is the Audit Committee being doing, and are they still operating functionally?
Well, I can only speak on behalf of my own audit function. Alison may want to talk about it in terms of arm's length bodies, but it's a very important part of the governance and assurance of any organisation, of course. And you referred yourself to Audit Scotland's comments about our own SG, Scottish Government Audit and Assurance Committee. We've taken those
I don't
extremely
specifically
seriously.
want to go into them here.
Yes, no, absolutely. No, it's very, very important. It's an integral part of the governance and assurance of any organisation, but particularly a government or an arm's length body to that government.
Just If I may add one further thing, and obviously you're referring to the Audit Committee during this particular period, and as I mentioned, Audit Scotland are present and have been present at that committee. The Audit Scotland reports for the financial years 2014-15 and 2015-16 about those accounts for audits for the SPPA made no reference to this project. And all I would say is that there was a tremendous amount of effort that was made by the Pensions Agency. Specialist subject matter experts were brought in. That's something that, in terms of the Chief Exec at the time, they approached me to say about bringing in people that would actually help with the continued diligence around the project delivery and also about the change process. As I say, this was one of 8 projects, major things that were happening to pensions in Scotland at that point in time that the agency were leading on. Other elements of those projects were actually software. And prior to this, the Pensions Agency had also delivered successful software changes, and they have subsequently. And the real concern was actually about the non-delivery by the supplier. And just to give you a sense of that, the diligence that was applied in managing that contract, not only the project boards, of which they were at least monthly, and they were more intensified as soon as there was issues. There was a requirement, and the Pensions Agency actually approached the government to say, can they be part of the pilot of what's now designed as the technical assurance framework that is in place? And so the Chief Information Officer actually became a member of that project board. So there was a huge amount of effort and scrutiny around the supplier to make sure that they would deliver. When that first failure came in, then there was a tremendous amount of work that was done to not look at the sequencing and the critical path of the project, one thing after another, but to actually work through what elements could be then built coterminously, which were not critical for one for the other, but actually to do them side by side so as to make up the time. Because the key thing here was that there was a hard deadline on this project. March 2017 was an absolute cut-off date for one reason alone. Of the 3 existing suppliers that were actually part of what was to be replaced by one supplier, because it was an integration of administration, payroll and web-based services, 2 of those suppliers were willing to extend. But one supplier was refusing to extend the contract between March 2017, so there was a hard deadline. So as I say, subject matter experts were brought in, and they were enabled for the project to be redesigned as it went along. And it was Capita that, one series after another failed to
Stafford,
actually
we appreciate
deliver.
the detail, but can you try and keep it a bit briefer? Is that okay?
Yes, of course. So I think those are some of the key things. So and those were that was the capacity that was there to actually support this and to keep it as on track as possible. I think the only other thing I would draw out in the effective management of this contract during this contract period, Capita, in terms of the contract terms, could have earned and should have earned if they had delivered £2.7 million. That's what the contract price would have been paid during this period that we're talking about. In the end, the Pensions Agency paid less than 0.7 million, and that just shows you that they were not paying or were not going to pay for anything that they didn't get. This contract was being rigorously managed, and the really sad thing from this is actually the lack of delivery that actually took place in supply.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. We had an evidence session with SPPA on the 26th September, which covered some of the changes to sponsors during the life of the project. Gordon Wales advised the committee that the sponsoring arrangement encompassed both line management of the Chief Executive and that of the public body's Fraser figure. Now, at different times during the project, these roles were combined and carried out by one Scottish Government official, and at other points they were split between 2 officials. And a Scottish Government sponsor official is also a non-executive director of the SPPA's Management Advisory Board. Looking at the timelines here of all this toing and froing on the sponsors, surely this must have contributed to the, well, frankly, chaotic project, the management of the project. I mean, what were these guys doing? What were the sponsors doing during this time? They must have been aware of the problems. What did they do?
So just to go to your first point, Gordon now has the role and responsibility of being both line manager and Fraser figure, so slightly different from the sponsoring process, but I understand the point you're making. The Fraser figure is a very particular role, and it is one that embodies the delegated responsibilities from ministers to the Director General, and the Director General then decides whether or not to take those roles and responsibilities on themselves or give it to a Fraser figure. I may be wrong, I'm willing to be challenged on this, but I don't recall another occasion when we have had a Fraser figure combined with the line management responsibility. As far as I'm aware, though I don't go through all of I wasn't present as permanent secretary for a good chunk of this project. I think Gordon is the first time to have a Fraser figure and a line management responsibility in one.
But
However,
I think according to the information I've got, I think April 2015 to June 2015, the roles were combined.
not that I'm aware of. However, the point you make is about the quality and nature of the Fraser figure role. And the people who were acting as Fraser figures between 2014 and indeed up to Gordon's time were two of our most experienced finance officials, people who worked for Alison Stafford and colleagues of Collins, Eleanor Emberson, later on Eleanor Ryan, and Alistair Brown. Both very experienced, not just in terms of the Fraser figure responsibilities, but also in the implementation of major IT projects themselves. So they would be very clear about not only their roles and functions, and Gordon can talk a little bit more about that, but also about their responsibilities in terms of attending board meetings, which they did, seeing the management advisory board papers, which they did, and of course alongside this having a line management responsibility with Alison for the most part. So these two functions were a very important part of us being kept abreast of this, and then of course ministers were also being kept abreast of the process as well. So the rigorous process that Alison described and the management of the Capita relationship, particularly by Ross Patterson, which is the time that was most crucial, were familiar, would be familiar to those Fraser figures. Not only that, but we had the Chief Information Officer also on the board, and she and her colleagues were part of the independent testing at 3 different times during the project's
Now, I presume
life.
that whoever was discharging this function for the Scottish Government was well aware of the problems that were taking place within the project. How did they discharge their duties in terms of that? How did they assess the risks of success? How did they report that up the line? I feel this should have been flagged before.
Okay, so I think you're right. The Fraser figure is one of support but also challenge on behalf of the Scottish Government, and the Fraser figure would have a relationship with both the Minister and with line managers in terms of reporting back. The role and responsibility of executing the project and also keeping the government appraised was the accountable officer, and he was doing that on a regular basis. It wasn't that we weren't aware. We were part of the solution and part of the testing and probing of Capita to see what they could deliver, particularly at the 3 junction points that are mentioned in the IT independent review, the amber and the amber red, and then the red categories that you will have read about in the report and accompanying documents. I don't know if, Alison, if you want to say anything about the Fraser figure information that was relayed to you.
Yes, certainly. So both through line management, regular contact, and also through the Fraser figure feedback from the various project boards, management advisory boards, and so on. So there was an awareness. There was a very clear awareness that what was happening was that what had been contracted for by Capita was not being supplied, and was not being supplied by the deadlines that were required. As I say, the first indication of that lack of supply was around the end of July, early August in 2016. And at that point then there was some further extraordinary project board session that was set up, which was in the middle of August. I personally went to that. And to meet the senior representative, who was actually the signatory on the contract from Capita, to both stress and expect that the contract as delivered is what we needed and would require and insisted that that needed to be the case, and also to see the replanning and the reprofiling in the way that I described, that there was this separate blocks of activity identified that wouldn't happen in sequence, they would happen coterminously. Also to get a more regular presence on site of the Capita software development team. A lot of their work was being done remotely, and so space was made available to actually get people from Capita on site so that actually they could be there, they could test anything that they wished to by way of interpretation of regulations and specification. As I say, some of that was...
we're running short of time. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
So what I would just add is that so there was oversight, there was knowledge. Ministers were briefed at key times where these various things were happening, and equally when there was the particular change in October, when there was a recognition that Capita were going to fail to meet their deadline of March, then there were specific actions that were then taken.
Thank you.
I think just to add, the three areas of assurance, so those very specific points, again, of the levels of assurance work, the scrutiny that was done by the Chief Information Officer, were really, really important.
Okay.
That was an independent means to, again, hold Capita to account, not only during the contract, but, you know, sadly, subsequently, when they actually it had to be closed.
We can give you some information in writing on that if that's helpful.
That would be very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Can I thank you all very much for your evidence this morning? I now close the public part of this committee meeting as we move into private session.